Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm Director of Communications at the Center for Security Policy. Welcome to the next event in our webinar series. As you can see by my background, we're back in our DC offices, at least some of us are, so some level of normalcy has returned to the center. Today's program is entitled From Elections to Electrons, Cybersecurity Threats to America's Infrastructure, featuring our own Tommy Waller and George Cotter. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. You are in listen-only mode, but you can pose text questions in the Q&A box on your GoToWebinar control panel, and I will pass those on to the panelists at the end of the program. We will be recording this event. It will appear on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, as well as on our website, securefreedom.org. And with that, I'll hand it over to my center colleague, our Director of Infrastructure Security, Tommy Waller.
Thank you, Adam. Tommy Waller here, Director of Infrastructure Security with the Center. One of the things that the Center sponsors is the Secure the Grid Coalition, which I have the privilege of directing on a weekly basis. And it's important for our audience to know today that the Center itself is a nonprofit 501c3, nonpartisan national security policy-making organization. And so we're going to talk a little bit about elections, and we're going to talk about infrastructure, but it's from the perspective of national security. And that's what pleases me today, to be able to introduce one of our Secure the Grid Coalition's most esteemed experts. That coalition is filled with experts ranging from electromagnetic pulse to solar weather to cybersecurity. But George Cotter is preeminent among those experts on cybersecurity. George and I have had the privilege to work together on multiple different filings to different federal organizations about cybersecurity for the U.S. electric grid. And over that time, what he shared with me is some very, very significant things about cybersecurity and our elections and our election systems. This is a topic that the Center hasn't covered a whole lot yet. And so it's been a privilege to know that George is willing to work with us today to talk about some things, some of which have never even been written about, when it comes to how our enemies are targeting our election infrastructure, and how some of that has linkages with how they're going to target our electric grid infrastructure. So with that, today we're going to cover mostly the Russian Federation and the threat from that vector. And so what I want to do is just turn it over to George for a moment. George, as you know, if you read the webinar intro, was previously the CIO and held many other esteemed positions at the National Security Agency. So George, if you would, just briefly introduce for us the threat from the Russian Federation when it comes to cyber warfare.
Well, that's a very deep threat, and it's pretty mature. And there's no question at all the threat is led from the top of the Federation government. So we're dealing with something which is ominous in respect to anything which is of value to this country: critical infrastructures, our elections, our grid. Unfortunately, in this case, the 2016 election, there was a tight relationship between the attackers and the grid and the election itself, which has not been explained really by anybody, certainly not me. So the Federation has two active elements. One is the GRU, which is an element of the Ministry of Defense, and the other is the FSB. I won't expand that in Russian, but that's basically the remnants of the KGB in the mid-90s, when the Soviet Union went belly up. The KGB was reorganized, and some of the strictures that were on the Ministry of Defense GRU in terms of what they could do under the Soviet Union were removed. And they have very much been what I call the Swiss Army knife for the Federation, used wherever they need to use a cyber actor and not worry much about its exposure. Okay?
Yes, sir. And this 2016 event, from my recollection of our discussions, the planning went as far back as 2012, right, or even further. Can you kind of expand on that story of how we?
Well, some is speculation, so I'll say that right up front. Clearly, Mr. Putin was upset at the re-election of Obama, because that meant that the sanctions against Russia were going to continue, and in a sense get worse because Hillary Clinton was going to be the Secretary of State. So that was a bad picture to be looking at. If there's a moment in history where Putin made his mind up about interfering in the 2016 election, I think it was that. In any event, some of the things that happened back in 2012 were rather unusual. The Federation, either the FSB or the GRU, got into the product organization in 3 grid vendors that have about 90% of the US market for control systems. And what they did was to bug those 3 control systems. And in 2014, the GRU came into our grid system and had some fun. Go on with your questions.
So when we talk about the Russian Federation's penetration of the grid, we're looking as far back as 2014. That sounds an awful lot like preparation of the battlefield, right? I guess in a military confrontation, all of us, that's one reason we have the Secure the Grid coalition, is we know our dependency on the grid. I think this audience is pretty interested in finding out how is it that they also targeted our election system and the elections themselves, and how that sort of corresponds to their penetration of the grid, if you could lay that out for us.
Well, I think one of the sad things to this day is, in fact, that the penetration of the grid has never been, as a US federal level, connected to the election. I have done that, frankly, through forensics in both cases. Okay, the evidence is there. But the FSB had never done anything major in the United States, but turned loose as early as 2013 against the United States. And that meant reconnaissance for the FSB in terms of understanding the networks, not just the networks for the participants in the 2016 election, but the federal networks overall, particularly the defense networks. Keep in mind that the Federation had no idea what the US reaction was going to be to what they had planned for the election. So they had to have options. And to this day, I believe that one of the options was something involving the grid, which they never used. Okay, but the connection was there, not just in the fact that it's the same organization, the GRU, but it's there in terms of the forensics in both cases.
So, George, when the Russians are conducting this reconnaissance, whether it be in the U.S. grid or just in the United States in general, via that cyber domain, how do they? Is it Russian agents? Are they able to hire other foreigners, Americans, to do their bidding? Can you tell us a little bit about how they operate?
Well, back in 2014, they had, of course, salted the control system so that an entry was relatively easy. Incidentally, the underpinning for that was a Microsoft vulnerability, which they used. Okay. Now, the penetration of the U.S. grid was buttoned up by the industry itself, by the regulators, and by the FBI and by DHS. There was a substantial investigation by DHS and the FBI, but that report was not made public, although it was briefed to the industry and briefed to the federal authorities. Okay, so that's the kind of, we in our community use the term security through obscurity, and that's what's been going on here. And that's the reason why the grid has never been directly associated with the election. But it was part and parcel of election, and just in terms of the organization that did work in both areas simultaneously.
Well, George, that's a story all of us want to hear. And I think that, like you said, it hasn't been told yet. And this is going to be the first opportunity for it to be told. So if you would kind of back us up to who are the key players, if they can be named, whether Russian or otherwise, who made this happen, who were able to affect the 2016 election and up to that point.
Okay, well, the FSB was very busy in making sure that the U.S. infrastructure that would have to be exploited was well known. Now, how did they do that? They recruited a hacker, an Estonian. His name was Belan, B-E-L-A-N. He was operating in Las Vegas. They recruited him, and he managed to download from Yahoo a substantial portion of the internet database to the FSB. They moved him from Las Vegas to Greece. He operated out of Greece. It was somewhere in that time frame that the FBI got a line on him, perhaps at Las Vegas, but and had Interpol get him arrested in Greece. But somehow or other, Russians got him out of jail and moved him to Russia. All that took place between 2013 and the 2015 penetration of the DNC servers and the DNC networks by the FSB in 2015. GRU is still busy with the grid. But the FSB did the initial penetration of the democratic structure. And that job, once it was all sort of set up, they turned it over to the GRU. The FSB was not seen in that venue again. It all became, at that point, a GRU exercise. And obviously the GRU had been training for this. Okay.
Wow.
They knew what they were doing. And their game plan was pretty well laid out.
So we have the same organization that now has penetrated the U.S. grid, has also penetrated the DNC server, and has kind of an overarching guidance from higher headquarters, Putin, if you will, pointing to the 2016 election. Please do continue on this story.
Oh, okay. Well, the penetration of the Democratic run up to the convention was to the convention and to the election pretty well written up in the press. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that.
Yes, sir.
But the Obama administration, although they had a heads up from the intelligence community and from the FBI that this was going on, Obama decided not to, other than back channels with Russia, try to discourage them from what they were doing. I think the reason was simple. He believed that Hillary Clinton would win the election, and that was, he had from the very beginning of his tenure as a president been very skittish about the whole cyber security, cyber warfare game.
Right.
And but the Russians were not, and the GRU got a lot of training before that 2016 penetration of the election in how to deal with penetration of foreign activities. The Olympics, the attempts to undercut a study of Russian athlete doping that was going on in Switzerland, several elections in Europe. Okay, these are all very well documented, but that's where the GRU got their training for what they had to take on here in the DNC. So they took, having gotten access to these servers, having downloaded a tremendous amount of material from those servers, and having in using phishing techniques to penetrate about 30 users of the DNC network, were loaded with material. They created this mythical character called Guccifer 2.0, and he was a channel. He was theoretically a Romanian, but he spoke very bad Romanian, I'm told. He was the funnel for material which went into something called DC leaks. Again, this is well described in the press, and that's where the material that went out into the public domain through WikiLeaks, Assange's operation in London, and served to, in Russian terms certainly, undermine the Clinton campaign. Obama made a serious mistake in not taking those events, which are well documented, and immediately putting sanctions on Russia to stop any further interference before the election occurred. He did not do that. Okay.
That should be absolutely a lesson learned for the current president.
Right.
While we're on that time frame, George, because you talked about 2015 time frame and a penetration of the DNC server, I recall, and probably a lot of our viewers, because they're members of the Secure the Grid Coalition, I recall an event in Ukraine related to Russia and cyber warfare. What can you tell us about what happened there and how it may or may not have any effect with the timeline that you've just described?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you're alluding to here, so tell me more.
The blackout. So the Ukraine experienced an electrical blackout, which many said was that the Russians were responsible for that. Is there anything you can tell us about whether or not that has credence, or if the members involved that you just described could have been involved in that?
Well, for one thing, the GRU development of training of people and development of tools and malware continued on straight through the election, and their favorite testing ground was the Ukraine.
I see.
Okay, now it was convenient for certain US federal organizations to disclaim any connection between those activities in the Ukraine and the US grid effort, which further obscured the connection between the grid and the election, obviously. But in 2015, the GRU went into the Ukraine and took down about 50% of the Ukrainian what's called the distribution system. This is the area of their network that feeds the consumers themselves.
Yes,
they went in a fishing expedition 6 months or so before they did this in December of 2015. And when they moved in just before Christmas in 2015, they had passwords and they were able to take over control of the grid. They did no damage. They were not there to damage the grid. What they did was to test their tools. Incidentally, the same tools that we had seen in the grid between 2014 and 2015. Okay, and
right.
And they perfected those tools and developed two, one called X-Agent, one called X-Tunnel, which they used for the first time, in my knowledge, in the election. So here's the GRU in this Ukrainian test facilities. Basically, that's the way they considered this system, and tested those tools and used them later in 2016 in the US election. That's the forensic evidence. The FBI knows this, the DHS knows this, but they have chosen not to make that connection between the grid and the election. The problem is that what did the Russians really have in mind for the grid if things began to go bad for them. Okay. What if Obama had sprung sanctions on them in July of 2016? Would they have tested our Obama a second time? Okay, on his wishiness about cyber warfare? I think so.
Right.
And they have targets. There's no question about that. And those targets are basically free for them whenever they choose to use them.
So to my understanding, George, and I know this is something you and I have worked on extensively with our different comments to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and otherwise, a lot of that malware still exists in our grid, and there's no requirement to have it removed. So it, to me, is for sure a very concerning thing, and that it's a thing that we're working, our Security Grid Coalition is working hard to remedy. George, we talked about, up until this point, the first 20 minutes, we talked about the lead up and a bit into the 2016 election. I think for the next 20, perhaps we could have a discussion about what happened after. Like, what has the response been to that, those attacks in the 2016 election? And then perhaps the last third, we could get into a discussion about perhaps what's in store for 2020. Can you share with us a little bit about the repercussions of 2016 and what the U.S. government has done or failed to do?
Yeah, sure. A lot of this is public knowledge. The Obama, the intelligence community produced a report, which they, a classified report, released an unclassified version of that after the election, so that people understood, in layman's terms at least, what Russia had been up to in the election itself. That report was recently revalidated by a bipartisan study which is underway in the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Section 4 of that committee's report is in the public domain. Read it. They validated what the Intelligence Committee reported prior to the election to Mr. Obama. Okay? Now, to go on from there, Obama, on the 29th of December in 2016, gave a public announcement of sanctions against the Soviet Union. I'm sorry, against Russia. Excuse the slip. There's not a lot of difference.
Right.
But
Right.
The sanctions were by name named a set of GRU and FSB offices. The names had been given to them by the classified community. And included in that list was the name Belan, B-E-L-A-N. This is the Estonian, he's a super hacker. And he's now in Russia, and he recently attacked the German parliament, incidentally.
Wow.
That's made the European press, but I haven't seen much in the US press about that at all. Now, the FBI opened an investigation on Russian penetration of the election before the election, and that investigation has taken a number of different turns. One was to, as much as possible, to provide to the Justice Department, to prosecutors, evidence to support the Obama declaration on the names of the FSB and GRU offices. And that went before a grand jury, and it was announced in 2017. Unfortunately, the indictment was embargoed by the FBI for a full year. It wasn't open to the public until 2018. I pulled down a copy as soon as it was available, and it gave several pieces of information about how the Russians had performed up to that point in time, but not much more than that. Nothing in that about the penetration of the state election systems during the election and after the election.
Which
Would you
took
like
place,
to
right?
talk about
George,
that?
I mean, Didn't the states were penetrated, right?
Big pardon?
The states were penetrated, right? Based on your knowledge, state election systems.
Yes, and a lot of this appeared in the press because it was an FBI investigation underway, and anybody who has done any work with the FBI knows that if an investigation is open, has not been taken to the prosecutors or a grand jury, then it's likely the FBI is not likely to say anything at all about it. They can be compelled to. So what we know from press releases is that the GRU went systematically through an alphabetical order of the state election systems. 39 of them were positively identified. Now, what the FBI knows about those penetrations, they are not talking about even to this day. They were forced to brief the Congress. They were forced to brief the governor of Florida because they had gone quite deeply in Florida, including into the election machinery itself, the cyber system used in 2 different districts, voting districts. And but what they told the governor of Florida has not been made public, because what the FBI has done, of course, is say to them, look, I will tell you what's going on, but please respect the fact that we have an open investigation.
Right.
When they did that with Congress, one person in the Florida delegation, a congresswoman, gave an interview to the press and said she didn't understand why she could not tell her constituents what the FBI had told her.
So it got to the press. Mm-hmm.
It got to the press, yes. Now, what is leaked is that leaked out here and there are little bits and pieces out of the states. Some of the states refused to talk. Some of the states said things before they got gagged. I read somewhere, I haven't put my finger on it, but about a substantial part of the actual electoral database, the people who voted in the state of Illinois, was downloaded presumably by the Federation, whether it was the FSB or the GRU, who knows? Okay, so that's what's went on. And then everything sort of died down in 2017 after the indictment.
Right.
And
we had some elections in 2018 too, though, right? So the U.S. government been apprised now of this penetration, and particularly it sounds like swing states like Florida were a target. It certainly makes sense for a guy like Putin to want to dislocate our faith in this system, particularly in swing states. Can you tell us a little bit about between 2016 and 2018, because the elections that were going to take place that year certainly would have had some attention by the Russians as well, no doubt, right?
Well, I think I had a little bit to do with what happened in the 2018 election. One of my white papers, you know, I write papers that go to selective federal people.
Yes.
John Bolton had become the National Security Advisor just a few weeks before I was producing one of these. So the cover letter went to John Bolton. And in that cover letter, I told Bolton very simply, the Fourth Amendment and federal policy is gagging the organizations that can prevent penetration of election systems. And those organizations are the Cyber Command and the National Security Agency. Within 3 days of getting that letter, Bolton called a press conference, and at that press conference was the director of NSA, the head of the FBI, and the then lady head of the Department of Homeland Security. And in a very short period of time, he gave them instructions to do what they could do to block Russian interference in the upcoming 2018 election. That was about all. That was all that was heard. After the 2018 election, General Nakasone, the head of NSA and the Cyber Command, gave a press conference in which he said, yes, we succeeded in advising the IRA. This is a Russian troll organization that had been active in the 2016 election in the United States, limited, pretty well limited to things like Facebook and Instagram and
social media
devices like that. Yes, right. Their job was to influence the election in ways that have been obviously pre-planned. And so Facebook since that time has found 3,000 ads in Facebook that were traceable to the Russian Federation, to the GRU, not to the GRU, but to the IRA.
Right.
So as Nakasone, I'll paraphrase what he said in his press conference, but it was that the IRA had been warned, that the individuals had been in the IRA who are known by name have been warned not to have their fingerprints show up on the 2018 election because they were known and where they were known, and it would not go well for them personally. That was the message sent. And so the IRA did not participate in any substantial aggressive way, as far as I've been able to see, in the 2018 election. However, a lot of the remnants from the 2016 election were left over. The election was a setback, not unusual for a midterm election, but a setback for the party in power. And so we ended up with a Congress which was split between the House and the Democrats and the Republicans in the Senate. That was the effect. How much the warning to the IRA and shutting them down is anybody's guess.
Right, but to me, what that showed is the value of deterrence, right? We should thank you, by the way, for what you did to help inform Ambassador Bolton of this situation, and we should be thankful to him for what he did to take aggressive action and to deter that activity. So, George, we have maybe another 10, 15 minutes to talk about, now that we know what took place in 2016, some of what took place in 2018, the concept of deterrence, to maybe look forward to this November and see if you can let us know your thoughts on our preparedness for the next election and what you think the government should be doing to be ready for what our foreign adversaries seek to do in relation to that.
Okay, let me just start first of all with the situation in the grid. Okay, we've had now over 10 years of substantial effort by the regulators to keep the public awareness of Russian activities in the grid very low key.
Right.
The security industry itself, the people who have contracts with that industry, have been essentially gagged on what they can say about what they have had to do in Russian incursions in the grid. I don't believe that has abated really very much, but then again, the GRU has had lots of years now to really understand the vulnerabilities of the grid and what they would need to do to, if you will, send signals to the United States to be careful about cyber warfare. We may have your number.
Right. Okay,
so that's what we're all labeling, security through obscurity. We've written, lots of us have written filings to the FERC to get them to stop this practice of suppressing information on penetration of the grid, incidents in the grid, the failure of companies to meet the compliance requirements for cybersecurity protection of their facilities, even the obscuring of the actual name of the utility that's involved in the penalty. And it might be a substantial penalty. The most penalty ever paid has been $10 million by Duke Energy. Now, let's go back to the Russians. What have they learned all the way along through all of this? Well, this is opinion on my part. I have no great evidence to support this, but they're watching the run-up to the election, like all of us are. What's going on? How is this thing going to play out? And they must, if they're going to interfere in this election, have set aside several options for their hackers. And their hackers are going to be the GRU and the FSB. There's no question about that at all. My personal belief, and I think the evidence is mounting on this, is that they will not attempt to go into the state's election systems themselves and play games with the votes themselves. But they will try to influence the voting process itself by exploiting the substantial cultural, race, religious, and other things that have now becoming the center point for discussions about the differences between the two parties. And that's playing right into the hands of the Federation, because they can do that with disinformation.
Right.
They can do that by making it look like any such effort is coming from someone other than them. They
Right.
did that in the Olympics. They made their attack on the Olympics itself look like they were coming from North Korea.
Right. And this is something I know our audience is very concerned about, and rightly should be. In fact, we've done a number of webinars on the topic of this anarchy, on the possibility that the Marxist elements that are participating in it are connected to foreign actors, whether it be the Russian Federation and the remnants of the Marxist Soviet Union, or the People's Republic of China. So, George, we have maybe 6 or 7 minutes left before we get into the Q&A session. Can you tell us a little bit more about what we should be trying to do between now and November, and of course in general when it comes to our cybersecurity? I know you could probably talk for hours, but maybe
I don't want to take 2 hours on this. I'll give it straight from the shoulder. I'm really pretty depressed about how this nation is structured to deal with the Federation and what they may be up to, what they may do. One of the tools that they have, which got away from the GRU, they were testing it on a Ukrainian system, and it's called NotPetya. Now it looks like ransomware, but it isn't. There's no ransom collected. It got loose while they were testing it in the Ukraine. Evidently, the GRU was not aware that if it showed up on a Windows 7 system, that it would propagate very quickly around the world. One of the countries most badly affected by it, by NotPetya, was Russia itself. Unbelievable. And that's what convinces me that this was not a deliberate attack on the Ukraine. Now, that upset, of course, the Russian authorities enough that the GRU packed away NotPetya in November of 2017 after one last little test. So that's a weapon, that's a distributed denial of service attack, which is easily attributed to half a dozen other countries or terrorists or anything like that. And so that one worries me a lot as a sort of desperation weapon for the Federation.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the most likely thing is they'll have a playbook which attempts to exploit in information warfare the differences, the cultural and social and economic differences that are straining the nation very, very badly. So I'm absolutely convinced that the right next step for the United States is to take advantage of what the Defense Science Board recommended back in 2017 to the Trump administration, which was a declaration of a national deterrence policy. You draw a red line and you say, if you cross it, we will pay you back in spades.
Right.
And furthermore, if we see it coming, we'll do it before you do it.
Right.
And that's what they did in 2018, essentially.
Exactly.
There is one of Bolton's tasks that he put on the Defense Department was to write a National Security Decision Memorandum number 13. Now it's operative only on the national security community. It's a classified document. It's obviously been approved by Mr. Trump, and so it sits there as one option for the United States, short of if what has been called the Congressional Symposium, Cyberspace Symposium study of cyber
Right. The Cyberspace Solarium Commission, right?
So that commission has basically taken the Defense Science Board recommendation, added to it, and that's what they're trying to push through Congress today. The Longbeards say there's not much chance of that happening at all, certainly before the election, simply because those kinds of steps require some major attack to get the public and the Congress on the same wicket.
Jeez.
So unfortunately, I think what will happen will be interference in the election to support the party in power by Putin because he doesn't have any other choices, and using disinformation as much as possible. But at the election level, that is in the swing states where the electoral vote is so uncertain, trying to influence the population of that state to support the Republican agenda. That's what's likely to happen. And we'll, at the last minute, when it's evident that something like this is going on, there'll be a first-class political riot in the United States about what's going on. Whether NISDM 13 will be exercised by the national security community or not is going to depend on the White House.
Right. You could certainly see there being severe backlash for some, evidence of Putin trying to support the current administration and the Republican Party. So I could see why he may want to do that in an effort to create such an uprising and such confusion, dislocate the faith of Americans in this system. One of the things, we'll just kind of end on this so that our members know about our efforts in the Secure the Grid Coalition. For that cyber deterrence policy to work, it requires that those aggressive offensive capabilities that we have as a nation are protected and that they're powered by electricity. And so this is something that, George, I know you have been working extraordinarily hard to ensure. We are at the Center for Security Policy with our Secure the Grid Coalition. And so just before we get into our Q&A session, I do want to tell the audience that they can get involved in this effort. Securethegrid.com is our website. And before we close out, I'll be sure to give you an email. George, we have 15 minutes left, so I want to turn to some questions I've got that have come in from our audience. One is one of our coalition members in Texas, Emil Pena. Thank you for joining us today. One of the questions he had was, beside the grid and elections, how much can we trust Russian software in any other industry vertical?
Well, there's probably not a lot of Russian developed software running around in US systems. A great deal more to worry about there with China than with, I think, with Russia. Russia has no large-scale IT industry. Unfortunately, for this country, the IT industry depends on China, not simply for manufacturing, but for development. So a lot of the desktop systems and the telephone systems are developed in China, and they're made to order for the Chinese to put back doors in. And there's been lots of that kind of evidence that's shown up. The Chinese, with a perfectly straight face, the Chinese government denies it. Back when Premier Xi visited the United States, Obama took him into the woodshed. I think it came a bit as a surprise to Xi that the PLA, the Chinese military, were as aggressive in the US in cyber espionage. So the net effect of that when Xi went back was to move the PLA out of that activity in the United States, but turn the responsibility over to the Ministry of State Security in China. They are very good, they're very stealthy, and they are extremely good at exploiting supply chain vulnerabilities. What you would put in a cell phone, what you would put in a transformer, what you would put in 5G telephone, which is coming along.
Right.
The whole battle going on preventing Huawei from coming into the United States with 5G is the fear that we will not be able to stop their exploitation of 5G to the benefit of the Chinese government and the Chinese industry. So that battle is now joined, I believe, with the initiation of Executive Order 13920.
Right.
Okay.
And that executive order that George just mentioned is the one the president most recently signed on May 1st, that is directed towards securing the bulk power system, and it addresses a lot of those supply chain issues. We've been working hard on the issue of China and cybersecurity. I know a couple of our participants have asked that question about China. So, George, I'm glad that you got on that subject. I'll tell you another thing that the Center for Security Policy has sponsored is the Committee on the Present Danger China. You can go to presentdangerchina.org to see that. But while we have a few more minutes, I would just I'd like to talk about that from the perspective of the grid, since we said we were going to go from elections to electrons. George, what can you tell us about some of the things that you worry about in relation to the threat from communist China and our grid infrastructure?
Yeah, well, first of all, the structure of the grid itself is it's so fragmented, it's so broken up, and there are over 3,000 utilities that are independent or semi-independent. I don't hold out any hope, none, that defenses can be put in place for the grid that will matter very much, certainly to the Russian Federation. The only thing that will work is this national declaration of deterrence. Warn Russia point blank, don't cross the line. If you're in the grid and have malware in the grid, don't exercise it. The other thing, of course, is then to police up the hygiene of the grid. The regulators, the NERC and FERC, have spent an enormous amount of time to protect the utilities as institutions, but not the grid itself. They've managed to obscure the vulnerabilities of the grid through their policy of obscurity, through security through obscurity.
Right.
And they have enormous supporters in Congress. I don't see the Congress really coming down hard on that industry at all. Okay, they got a lot of lawyers sitting down on G Street, spent a lot of time up on the Hill. So the solution for the grid is simplify it. NIST standards for every utility, and but those NIST standards apply behind a defense, which is a frontline defense, the National Security Agency, the Intelligence Community, the Cyber Command.
Right.
And don't doubt for 1 minute that Russia and China don't fear those organizations, because they are in much poorer shape than the United States in terms of their vulnerabilities.
That's good to know.
Yeah, China is being very, very stealthy, but I think if that policy is declared back channel, they can be advised to stop some of the things they're doing on supply chain vulnerabilities and take their game somewhere else.
Absolutely. So we need deterrence, and we need to keep the lights on at NSA. Is what is a combination.
Absolutely.
So George, we have a few minutes left. That I want to get to a couple other questions. We did get a question about the Russians targeting of the DNC, whether they thought that was a target-rich environment. Did they do that to get dirt on Hillary because they thought she would win? Was it because they could not penetrate the Republican National Committee servers? I don't know if you have an answer to that, but that is, I've gotten a couple questions about why did Russia target the DNC and not the RNC in 2016?
Well, he had made his mind up years earlier that continuing a Democratic party in power in Washington, D.C. was not going to work to their advantage. That's an opinion, but I think all the evidence supports that. The other thing, of course, is that they did reconnaissance on the Republican National Committee, but they made no revelations of position, they made no exposure of emails, of files, or anything like that in their WikiLeaks, DC leaks activities. They're very much, their attack mechanism was focused on, from the very beginning, actually before that, back in 2015, on the DNC, not the RNC. So that's the answer to whoever asked that question.
Okay, no, I appreciate it, George. We have a couple more I'm gonna try to get to before we're done. One of them is about the potential and effect of Idaho National Laboratory's development of non-programmable industrial control systems, and when those might be ready. That's one question. The second one is, should we go back to paper ballots? Let's focus at the moment, though, on if you know about INL's development of non-programmable industrial control systems.
I really don't, and one of the reasons is that certainly over the last 2 or 3 years since the 2016 election, it's pretty clear to me that it takes a fundamental change in national policy, not some development in a national lab of a tool. ICS, of course, is the fundamental target of supply chain attacks.
Right.
And And we saw that in 2012. We saw that in 2014. We have seen that in a number of non-grid industries. That's at the heart of the issue with Huawei on 5G.
Right.
I have great respect for the national labs and the work that they're doing, but I do not believe that there's anything going on in the national labs that's going to fundamentally change the equation and keep the need for the national deterrence policy from being declared. If we don't declare it, cybersecurity in this country is at an end. At the moment, the Chinese are putting great pressure on the healthcare industry in the United States to make sure they steal any information needed on vaccines, treatments for viruses, or anything of that kind. They can turn around in a minute. Okay.
Right, and use it for their own purposes. Now, when we talk about pressure, there's another question, George. Putin has tremendous investments in the U.S. stock market through his hedge funds. Is this also a deterrent? In other words, is there a way we could target that to deter Putin or other bad actors? We know that the Chinese also have major investments. Is that an option?
Well, I think Chinese investment in the stock market or in U.S. companies is coming under increasing scrutiny because that's a backdoor into the U.S. economic system. And that's got people in Washington, both parties, concerned. So I think that's going to be a troublesome area for the Chinese. But fighting out cybersecurity ultimately in the stock market is not going to happen. Okay, I don't believe.
Okay.
I believe that investors, the national governments, national control of stock markets, and large companies are going to move away from participation in anything of that kind. Of course, it can always be done covertly.
Right. Okay. One more question. Last question, George, before we wrap it up, from our good friend Marty Waldman in Las Vegas. What about the DNC hack? He just asked a question about download timing and speeds being much more compatible with a thumb drive, per Bill Binney. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. I guess Marty's asking whether or not that could have somehow been, done from the inside out. Any feedback on that?
No, the big download from Las Vegas occurred in two parts. The first part, probably not by Bellin himself, but it was available for sale on the blacknet, and some or other the FSB got their hands on it. They may have bought it. Who knows?
Wow.
Okay, the FBI may know, but they're not. If they do, they're not speaking. The other portion of that database was downloaded, I believe, from either Greece or from Russia itself in 2014 by Bellin.
Right.
That's the whole Bellin story is a very, it'd make a wonderful movie.
I agree. I as I have had conversations with you in the past, I thought the same thing. And I mean, we need to be inspiring good cybersecurity professionals in our country to be able to be as aggressive as that adversary has been against us. And so, George, with that, I just want to commend you because you're one of those guys. You're one of the guys who, as an American, has spent your professional life fighting for the good guys in this cyber warfare domain. You've shared with me so many times that Americans need to wake up and know that we are in cyber warfare at this moment. So we have about 1 minute left, George. And so I just ask you to kind of complete the webinar with any parting thoughts that you have for our audience.
Yeah, well, let me just make sure the audience understands that I've been retired from NSA for over 10 years. I spent over 6 decades in the business. And the beginning of the Cold War to the very end of the Cold War. So this is an adversary I think I understand very, very well. China is a much more difficult problem because China, the modern China, is very much a modern institution.
Right.
But we are, as you said, we are deep into cyber warfare. Okay, it's the gentleman's version of cyber warfare at the moment. Okay, the kinetic element of cyber warfare, the kinetic bridge, has not been exercised except in a couple of cases. But don't doubt for one moment in military warfare that the kinetic bridge and the cyber bridge will be joined at the hip closely. The Cyber Command has 12 or 14 teams, well-trained teams, to protect the national security of this country. And it's a shame that the electric industry is doing what they're doing so selfishly.
Well, George, it's going to be our goal to change that. And so we appreciate your help with our Secure the Grid Coalition's effort, what you've taught us all along, what you've taught us on this webinar. If our audience would like us to do another, certainly send us a note, ask us what you would like to know about, and we can consider that in the future. The way that you can reach out to us is at securethegrid.com or info@securethegrid.com. Will send me an email, and then we can collaborate from there to figure out how we can do that, secure our infrastructure from elections to electrons. George, thank you so much for your time, and we'll certainly be back in touch with you soon. And everyone who joined us, thank you for yours. You all have a good day.
Thank you.